Right, folks, back again. Now, I don't know exactly when this episode will go out, but at the time of recording, so it's Tuesday, 6th of November today, 2018, which just so happens to be midterm elections day over in the US. And I believe the midterm elections are essentially considered like a referendum on a sitting president, which is sort of opposite to today's episode, because I've got to say, I think the questions about the mental health of Donald Trump have kind of been used as a weapon to call into question his fitness to hold office, probably more than any other leader. Well, at least in my lifetime, at least that I can remember, anyway. And what's interesting about it is sort of, you see, on the one hand, you've got people that sort of interpret his behaviour as unhinged, as unpresidential. You know, he's going to start a third world war or whatever, kind of this apocalyptic attitude towards him. Whereas on the other hand, you know, the other half of the country, they maybe consider his behaviour as more relatable. You know, he's down to earth, a man of the people. And, you know, apparently his approval ratings are up around 42 to 50% the day before the midterms. Unemployment's at a 50-year low. Median household income is at an all-time high. And then, you know, relations with North Korea appeared to have thawed significantly, which sort of raises the question that if those people claiming that Donald Trump is mentally unstable, if those people are correct, then is that necessarily a bad thing? And I think we're maybe going to tackle that question in a roundabout way today. So my guest today is Dr. Nassir Ghaemi. Nasir is a psychiatrist and researcher specialising in depression and bipolar illness. He is Professor of Psychiatry at Tufts Medical Center in Boston, a lecturer on psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. He's published over 200 scientific articles, over 50 scientific book chapters, and has written or edited over half a dozen books, including the book which forms the basis of today's discussion, which is the New York Times bestseller, A First-Rate Madness, Uncovering the Links Between Leadership and Mental Illness. Dr. Ghaemi, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Danny.
Okay, so before I even jump into this, I don't know if you know about this, if you're familiar with this, but your book, that book has got a bit of a cult following in the pickup community. Are you familiar with the pickup community by any chance?
No, I'm not.
No, so the pickup community is guys on the internet who feel they're not very good with girls, trying to go out and learn how to get girlfriends, basically. And apparently on a lot of the forums, because a lot of the guys that are sort of into that, there's a sort of vicious cycle there where they struggle to meet girls because they're feeling depressed, but because they're depressed, they struggle to meet girls, if that makes sense. So your book, I've noticed, keeps getting mentioned on the forums as a way for these guys to sort of feel empowered, to think, well, you know, actually feeling depressed, or whether, you know, you've got bipolar depression or whatever, that's not a reason to sort of hide away and shy away from the world. There's actually power in that, and you can actually get out there and, you know, empower yourself and meet a lot of girls. So yeah, I didn't know. Yeah, like you said, you weren't familiar with that, but that's a fact. You're quite popular with the pickup community as an inspirational book. So I don't know how you feel about that.
Well, you know, I'm a little past the age where I would have been active in that sense, but it's certainly I understand. I empathize with them, so I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah, I thought it was just an interesting angle. Anyway, so let's jump into this now. So sticking with the book specifically before we go a bit broader on it. So this book maybe falls into the realm of a field of research known as psychobiography, which is all about sort of trying to understand historical figures using modern day psychological theory and research, and then applying it retrospectively. And we'll sort of, we mentioned Trump, and we'll get to modern leaders a bit later on, but for now, I want to focus on this idea of psychobiography, looking at leaders from the past, because that's what the book's all about. So as I was doing a bit of research on this book and stumbled across this idea of psychobiography, a lot of people sort of criticize it, say it's not a legitimate endeavor, it's not really doable, there's too much speculation, too much reliance on secondary sources. So I'd just like you to start by sort of talking about that, really, why you maybe feel it's a justified field of research.
Right. Well, I can say I think I agree with some of those criticisms. I think there's a better way and a worse way of doing psychobiography. In my view, the worst way, which is the way it's mostly been done, is psychoanalytically oriented. The whole idea started with Freud, who wrote a book about Woodrow Wilson, and then Erik Erikson later wrote books about Gandhi and Martin Luther. The way they did it was to take some couple of publicly known facts and then really speculate backwards into the childhood of these people and think about what they were like when, in the terms of their unconscious wishes when they were children in relation to their mother, their father, etc. That's obviously extremely speculative and justly criticized by many historians. On the other hand, I prefer the phrase psychological biography to try to distinguish what I'm doing from that tradition. What I've done here is really do the same thing that I do with patients and the same thing we do in research on diagnoses, which is to look at the symptoms the people have, their genetics, the course of their illness, and their treatments they've received, all of which are relatively objective, externally verifiable facts, and then to put all that together to support or oppose a diagnosis as being probabilistically present or not. That's how I would approach a patient in my office, and that's how the approach I took in the book.
Okay, so I mean, maybe delving into that a little bit more. So, I mean, we'll probably talk about Lincoln a bit more later on, but let's take Lincoln specifically as an example, because he lived pre-Freud, I believe, maybe a tiny bit of overlap, but definitely pre-DSM. So just from a practical research perspective, before we actually get into the psychology of Lincoln, mm-hmm. What would be involved there? What kind of sources would you be looking at? How would you do that research? And what would you be looking for to then apply a psychiatric diagnosis to him retrospectively?
So, one clarification is that everything I wrote about, more or less, most of it was based on primary sources, not secondary sources. So the kind of research you look at are letters that Lincoln wrote. And one of the benefits of people from the mid-19th century to the later 20th century is that in the pre-internet era, people wrote plenty of letters. And back then, General George McClellan, for instance, wrote a letter every day to his wife. So we have written documentation, more or less, of his internal subjective mental state in private letters, not intended for public consumption. So they're often quite uncensored. So we have these kinds of letters between Lincoln, for instance, and his wife and his friends. We have memoirs by his friends. We have contemporary news interviews of Lincoln, observations made by people who were with him. And sometimes the memoirs, of course, can be criticized a little bit in terms of being written after he became famous, sometimes a little overly positively. But when they report, things that can be seen as negative, such as making suicide attempts, it's pretty impressive to see that, even when the usual bias is a positive one after someone becomes famous. So those are the kinds of primary sources that we could use that are very high quality sources.
And then how would you go about then making a diagnosis based on that?
Well, the diagnosis of depression is not only pre-DSM, it's pre-everything. It goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Melancholia is well described in Aristotle and other writings back then. It's been used by doctors literally nonstop from the 3rd or 4th century BC until now. We don't need to use DSM, which was the current version of which was really based on the edition of 1980, which I personally think is mostly unscientific and invalid. So I really wasn't using that at all. But I'm just basing the diagnoses on scientific evidence and research, which we have over 100 years, easily 200, that shows that there is such a thing as a mood illness where there are periods of being really sad and down and blue and slowed down depression, and periods of being sped up and high and overactive mania. And both the concepts of mania and melancholia have existed in the world literature going back to the Greeks. So those are the concepts that I used.
Right. Okay. Now, I've got to say this idea of the link between mental illness and creativity. That's sort of a well-known, well, I mean, it's a much speculated upon correlation, I guess. But this one specifically, this idea of the correlation between leadership and mental illness, I've not stumbled across that one before. So I'm just wondering, are you the first person to posit this connection, or has this idea itself got some history to it?
Well, I wish I could take credit for being the first person, but I have to give the credit to Aristotle, who clearly stated this thesis in his famous lecture on melancholia, where he said that and it's actually the quote that begins my book on the front page is this one, where he said, "Why is it that famous politicians, poets, and philosophers all seem to suffer from the disease of melancholia?" To paraphrase it. And so he specifically listed not just poets, who when most people think about psychiatric illness, manic depression in particular, in terms of writers and artists and musicians, and there's plenty of research on that and experience with it. But he also talked about politicians and philosophers, and I think he may have mentioned generals too. And that's what I wanted to emphasize, that's the strand that's been lost over the last 2,000 years. The idea of madness and genius has been associated with creative professions. But I think, and Aristotle's point was this, I think it applies to all professions and all activities. And I wanted to emphasize the politicians and the military leaders because those are the ones that had been the most ignored. And I think the importance of this concept applied to them is not just an academic matter, but it's really practically important because we're all affected by our politicians and our military leaders.
Why do you think that's a concept that's been lost? And is it a concept that has been lost, or one that's been sort of shoved, like swept under the carpet maybe?
I think it's, I think it's pretty much the same thing. I think that for some reason or another, the link to writers and artists has been accepted and to everyone else has just been ignored. One rationale might be that we can allow for our writers and artists to seem odd or weird or strange and to have them kind of on the periphery of society. But people have been unwilling to accept that the core of our society, the very leaders who are most important for everything, the ones who run the governments, the armies, and the big businesses, actually also have these manic depressive conditions. That's hard to accept because of the extent of stigma and discrimination against mental illness.
Right, okay. So this book focuses primarily on bipolar or manic depression specifically, which of course is your speciality.
Mm-hmm.
What is it about that diagnosis? Before we get into the individuals, let's talk about this more broadly. What is it about that diagnosis in particular that sort of makes it significant from a leadership perspective and maybe from a creative perspective as well?
Right. Well, there is research that shows that there's benefits to depression and mania, and there's a lot of clinical experience also. Basically, what's been found is that people who have depression are more realistic and empathic than those who are not. And people who are manic are more creative and resilient to trauma and stress than those who are not. And so if you have normal mental health, you have limitations on these traits compared to people who are depressed and manic. And these traits are especially good traits for crisis leadership, which was the main theme of my book, and I tried to show examples with different leaders. I think this is unique to manic depressive illness. There's no evidence, for instance, that if you have chronic delusions, as in schizophrenia, it's beneficial. There's no evidence that if you have anxiety and panic attacks, it's beneficial. Some people will claim other things like ADD or sociopathy are beneficial, but my view is that there's been a lot of misdiagnosis over the years where manic traits get misdiagnosed. For instance, when people have mania, they're distractible, so a lot of times they get labeled ADD, or they're impulsive and arrogant, so they get called narcissistic or sociopathic. But there isn't actually good scientific research that shows that those conditions are associated with positive traits like creativity, etc., especially if you control for the diagnosis of also having bipolar illness at the same time. So I think the bottom line is that both clinical and research evidence is just there, that there's these benefits to manic depression, and it's more or less unique to this illness.
Well, okay, a couple of things there. So with the depression, so you mentioned there that depression makes people, tends to make people more realistic and more empathic. That the first claim there of being more realistic, firstly, what do we mean by that? And again, from a leadership perspective, what do we mean by somebody being more realistic? And also, how do we know that to be the case?
Okay. Well, there's two ways of talking about it. One is from the experimental psychology literature, and the other is from the historical analysis. We should begin with the experimental psychology literature. That's the science base for it. So the kinds of studies they do is called contingency tests. Psychologists often have done a lot of these, and there's about 30 years of research to back this up. Many studies. It's rather well established. So in these contingency tests, scientists will, for example, control whether a light comes on, and the person who's the subject of the experiment pushes a button, and the light comes on when they push the button sometimes, and it doesn't come on other times. And then you ask the person how much control they felt they had over the light coming on with a certain scale. And one also does, at the same time, depression rating scales in those people, self-report, which gets a baseline assessment. And what you find is that the people who score 0 on the depression rating scales, meaning they're completely normal, overestimate their control over the button coming on. Those who have a mild amount of depression estimate it correctly. And then there are various other things one can do to the experiment, like giving a little bit of money for it or giving some kind of reward and seeing how that affects their claim to control the environment. Turns out that normal people feel even more in control of the environment when they get some reward, whereas mildly depressed people don't. There are other studies that look at things like cancer diagnoses. And if you take a normal mentally healthy person, they often overestimate their prognosis, even though it's very well established, say the prognosis of a certain cancer or HIV. There have been studies of this, whereas mildly depressed people estimate their prognosis more accurately. So this is the kind of studies that are done scientifically that show that the lack of realism is there, and it's mostly related to one's control of one's external environment or the prediction of what will happen in the future under certain circumstances, like having an illness. The way this plays out in leadership, in my view, if we now kind of transition to how this is relevant to historical analysis, leaders are also in a position to make judgments about how much they control their external environment and make judgments about what is going on in the external environment. And what you see with normal mentally healthy leaders is that they often make mistakes about the external environment and make judgments often in the direction of feeling that they have more control, that they can get more done, whereas the depressed leaders are less realistic about it. That's just a small example. Chamberlain, normal mentally healthy, made certain judgments about what he could control in his relationships with Hitler and negotiations, whereas the depressed, realistic Churchill was more accurate in what could be done and what could not be done in terms of interacting with Hitler.
Well, I guess what's interesting there is how, say with Chamberlain, are we applying the same level of analysis to someone like Chamberlain to come to the conclusion that he was mentally healthy? Because obviously, he's not as sort of historically significant as someone like Churchill, probably much less researched.
Well, no, actually, there's plenty of evidence because, again, these people wrote letters, personal private letters a lot. If they were psychiatrically hospitalized, we would know about it. If they were treated by doctors, the evidence would be there. It's the same evidence we talked about before, having the symptoms, the genetics, the course of illness, and treatment. And if you look at those same lines of evidence with Churchill, you have lots of evidence of depression and treatment for it and so on. with Chamberlain, you have lots of evidence of absence of depression or no treatment for it. And so the mental health, I should maybe clarify, means that one does not have depression and mania. And otherwise, one's personality is more or less within the range of normal traits. And there's plenty of research on that. And that can be addressed pretty well with a basic biographical knowledge of a person. Like Chamberlain, for instance, was a very stable, solid, reasonably sociable person. There's no evidence in his life of unusual behaviors. Again, he didn't have depression, wasn't hospitalized, was never treated. No one in his family was. That's the line of evidence that suggests that he was basically a mentally healthy, normal person.
So when you say that this sort of applies sort of uniquely to bipolar, would that exclude people that who are chronically depressed as well? Do we need both sides of the coin?
I didn't say bipolar. I didn't say bipolar. I said manic depressive, which is important to clarify. It's not the same thing.
Oh, okay.
Because bipolar is a DSM term, and like I said, the DSM terms are not really perhaps as valid. Before 1980, after 1980, DSM implemented the terms of bipolar and so-called unipolar depression. That before 1980, those terms were not used, and the term manic depressive illness meant both of those conditions, meaning having depressive episodes alone, no manic symptoms at all, or having depressive and manic episodes. Today, what we call unipolar depression, which means recurrent severe depressive episodes, and bipolar illness, which means depression plus manic episodes, both of those together is what we used to call manic depressive illness. And what I'm referring to both, I'm not referring just to the bipolars. There are benefits to just having depression, even if you don't have manic episodes. And by the way, there's also people that only have manic symptoms and don't have any depression, often as part of their temperament, manic temperaments. We call that hyperthymia. And I think for President Trump, for instance, is describable that way. Those people also have some benefits to having manic symptoms, but they never have any depression. So it's not both. It can be either or, manic or depressive symptoms.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's a bit of a tricky one. The term manic depression now is sort of frowned upon. I've been sort of pulled up on that a few times to, you don't say that anymore. It's bipolar.
Yeah, that's a bit of Orwellian hegemony. There's no reason to frown upon it. There's no scientific reason to say that we shouldn't use the term manic depression. The only scientific claim would be to use the word bipolar rather than manic depression, is to claim that the bipolar illness and unipolar depression are two different diseases, whereas previously the view was that they were all one disease, which was called manic depression. That's a different scientific discussion, but I could argue that that's not true. So there's no scientific reason not to use the phrase manic depression. If one was trying to claim for social reasons that one doesn't like the phrase, that's another discussion entirely. But I personally think the term manic depressive illness is a very good term and preferable to the term bipolar, which has many, many assumptions, that some of which are not scientifically proven.
Yeah, I've got to say, Nasir, just as a sort of little tangent, there's been a few discussions that have not happened on this podcast as a direct result of sort of language policing in the mental health realm.
Yep.
So yeah, it's probably an episode all of its own that I need to get round to. But no, it's you're the first person I've spoken to who's gone off the reservation, let's say, with that.
Well, I have to say, I've been in the field for 25 years. As you said, I specialize in bipolar illness and depression, manic depressive illness. And that the main textbook in the field is called Manic Depressive Illness. It's published by Frederick Goodwin and Kay Jamison, and it's been republished in 2007. And they titled it Manic Depressive Illness on purpose because they wanted to send a message to the field that the bipolar concept and unipolar depression hasn't been proven. It's just that it may in fact be disproven. And Kay Jamison's certainly been very public on this view as well. So is Frederick Goodwin, who's one of the most senior experts. So there are a few of us who have a lot of knowledge about this condition who take the view I just described.
Yeah, that's Frederick Goodwin. I'm going to note that one down. Maybe send out an invitation on that one. It's interesting topic. Okay, let's get back on track. So,
yep.
So a couple of things sort of being thrown up for me here in considering this analysis. The first is that If we take somebody that's been a successful leader, seemingly based on their mental ill health, so let's say Churchill, why would we attribute their successes to the illness rather than them just being a creative or an ambitious person?
Yeah. Well, I mean, here's the approach I would take on this. We know that manic symptoms, for instance, are associated with creativity. So it's a scientifically associated fact. So it's not unreasonable to ask the question whether some of Churchill's creativity may have been due to manic symptoms, and you can then look for other evidence of the manic symptoms in his life which exist. If you don't do that and you write it off, I don't see the rationale for that. This is not to say that there might not be other reasons why he was also creative, although there aren't actually a lot of scientifically proven predictors of creativity besides mania. Obviously, you have to have intelligence and other things, but many intelligent people aren't that creative. So I think from my perspective, I would turn the question around and say, well, when you know it's scientifically associated, why not assess it?
Right, okay. And what about, has there been any significant successful leaders? I know you do actually, probably should have pointed this out earlier on, you sort of emphasize the distinction between someone being a crisis leader and sort of a peacetime leader. Mm-hmm. Is there any examples of crisis leaders that were successful, that did a good job of getting the country, the people, whatever, through a crisis, that didn't display any sort of symptoms of mental illness?
You know, that's a good question. And I have to tell you, when I started writing A First Rate Madness, which was about a decade ago now, I didn't have the view that I'm going to state now. But as I got into the research on it and I looked into it more and found more and more leaders the crisis leaders that I looked into all seemed to have manic depressive symptoms of some variety. I couldn't find any that didn't. Aristotle in his lecture actually made the claim that there is no one who is truly prominent creatively in who is not manic depressive, who doesn't have melancholia or mania, as he would put it. I'm come to close to the view that he's right. I'm very doubtful, actually, anymore that there are any great crisis leaders who are not abnormal from this perspective of mental health, typically in the direction of having manic or depressive traits or symptoms or episodes.
You see, I can sort of, from my little amateurish psychological knowledge, you can sort of see when you've got this association with creativity and the mania and like this drive and ambition, and you can sort of see why people like that would end up in leadership positions. But then just to sort of look at it from the other perspective, how do we explain leaders that are just mentally healthy, that don't display those things? Like, how do they get into those positions in the first place when they're already up against these more ambitious, more driven types? Well,
maybe I can take a few minutes just to give my basic idea, and then maybe it'll become more clear after that. So my basic view is that manic depressive illness and symptoms helps people be great crisis leaders. It helps them be successful as leaders in times of crisis. Crises like war, revolution, major economic distress in the business world, a major crisis in a company or entrepreneurial setting where companies are coming and going, and it's very unstable. Those same manic depressive traits do not help people be leaders in times of peace and prosperity, in non-crisis times. No wars, no revolution, economic stability, a large corporation that's doing well and everything just needs to keep going the way it is. The non-crisis leaders who are mentally healthy do the best. Mentally healthy people in that setting are very sociable, predictable, stable. The past predicts the future for them. They don't rock the boat, and they're reliable. But in times of crisis, the past doesn't predict the future. And then you need leaders who are much more realistic, much more creative, and much more resilient than the average mentally healthy person. That's when the manic depressive leaders do well. So I'm not making a general claim that manic depressive illness helps leadership in general, because I don't think there is such a thing as general leadership. I think there's leadership in different settings, two big ones being crisis versus non-crisis settings. And I'm not saying mental health is not helpful in general. I'm just saying it's not helpful for crisis settings. It's quite helpful in non-crisis settings. Most of the time, most of the world, thankfully, is in a non-crisis setting. Most of the time, we're not in wars. We're not in economic depressions. A lot of the conflicts that people talk about are not even crises. If anything, if you want to call them something, they're mini crises, but they're just small conflicts. The U.S. right now is not in any major crisis. So the last somewhat crisis that we had was the Great Recession of 2008, and before that, 9/11, the attacks in 2001. Before that, we had an extended period of prosperity after the Cold War ended. Before that, you might talk about the 1960s era with Cold War peak. So, and the Vietnam War, of course. I mean, there are crises that come, but we're not constantly in a crisis. And most of the time, we're not. That's also the case, especially in regular life. Most businesses, most corporations, they go through very long periods where things can be quite stable, and then there's some change in technology or whatever that is a crisis for them. But the crises are brief, the periods of stability are long. That's why most of the time, most leaders are mentally healthy leaders, and they do quite well. It's just that when the crisis comes, they're not the best ones for it. Most of the time, the manic depressive leaders are not in charge. They're kind of waiting in the wings, and when the crisis comes, they can rise to the occasion. And when the crisis is over, they often have to go back to the periphery again. Think about Churchill in the 1930s being in the wilderness and unimportant in British politics, and of course, being the crisis leader in the 1940s, and then again kind of receding into the 1950s until his death in the early 60s. So, I think that one should not make a judgment, to answer your question, that because someone is a leader, that they're a good leader. They just happen to be in a position of leadership. And most people are mentally healthy who are leaders. They're not necessarily great crisis leaders, though, which is what I'm focusing on.
Do you think there's an argument to be made then for when... You see, I'm thinking about how the politics of this might work. Might not necessarily be a case of in a crisis, someone who's, well, we'll use the term manic depressive. Someone who's struggling with that. It's not necessarily the case that they're so ambitious that they sort of jump to the front of the queue, but a mentally healthy leader will just prove themselves so useless in the crisis that they're sort of forced to step aside.
Actually, I don't think that ambition has anything to do with it. The mentally healthy people are much more ambitious than the manic depressive persons, in my view, because, as I said, mental health involves the normal psychology of mental health involves a mild positive illusion. This view that you're, more intelligent than you really are, you're better looking than you really are, that you're going to be more successful than you really will be. There's a mild optimism to normal mental health, which is unrealistic, and that's been proven in these studies of depressive realism. It's not a bad thing from a pragmatic perspective. It's good to be optimistic, and it's good to be positive. In normal life, if you overstep your bounds, the rest of the world puts you back in your place. If you run into predictions that are too unrealistic. But when you're the leader and you have a certain amount of power and people around you are more likely to say yes than no, that mild positive illusion can grow into what Lord David Owen called a hubris syndrome, which he observed in Tony Blair, for instance, and George W. Bush, where the leader then loses too much touch with reality and makes very harmful decisions. But that's a normal phenomenon in my view. That's not psychopathology. That's normal mental health. And those people are very ambitious because normal people want to achieve and succeed. And most of us strive for more than we are somewhat capable of. And so we succeed to some extent. And we have a lot of ambition and drive. And most of the people are politicians and that are becoming elected and leaders in one way or another are just normal, mentally healthy people. They're the ambitious ones. But the manic depressive people, they struggle, especially on the depression side. Their self-esteem is low. They're not very ambitious. When they're manic, they might be a little more, they have more self-esteem, but they're not manic all the time. Usually they're manic briefly, and they're more depressed than they are manic in many cases. And there are people who have mania mildly all the time, and that's different, and that's relevant too. But even then, their ambition is tempered by either their depression or by their other traits, their impulsivity, some of their irritability can lead to not having as many friends or supporters as they otherwise might, and then they have to actually swallow their ambition and wait on the sidelines. Again, Churchill's a great example. He didn't have a ton of friends in the 1930s. People didn't really like him because he was irascible and irritable. Chamberlain had many more friends and was much more friendly. That's why he rose up the ranks of the Conservative Party so well.
Yeah, there's something sort of counterintuitive about when a crisis hits. If the evidence is there that these people make better crisis leaders, it's difficult to imagine a situation where, whether it be the public or the people already in power looking to shift things around will look at, Mr. and Mrs. Normal in power and say, you've got to go because a crisis is about to hit. But then the idea of consciously looking to somebody that's struggling with mental illness seems really it seems counterintuitive. It just seems like something that people would never consciously do.
Right.
But I'm wondering whether you think there's an argument for actually doing that, for saying, well, hang on a minute, that's a view based on stigma, and that
right.
is actually a legitimate position to maybe take.
Right. Yeah, it is counterintuitive. And my view is what you're saying, that we should be more consciously willing to take this view, because the only reason not to is a stigmatizing, discriminatory view that mental illnesses are inherently bad. I think what happens socially in an unconscious kind of way is that we turn to these leaders for reasons that we describe other ways. For instance, we say they're charismatic instead of saying they're manic. We don't understand what mania is socially. People don't really understand it. They call it charisma, this same sociability and extroversion that manic people have. Or we say, that they're just, we give them spiritual significance. We say that, they're just so impressive, they're saintly, and if you think about Gandhi, or they're just extremely resilient if you think about Martin Luther King. And we don't think about how we don't know that manic symptoms are part of why they can be so resilient. We talk about them as just being really empathic, really caring for other people, like in the case of Lincoln. And depression predisposes to that. But instead of understanding some of the biology and psychology behind it, we just give them a kind of a spiritual, characterological assessment that just makes them seem unique and special in a way that's almost metaphysical as opposed to physical. And these then become our heroes, these kind of otherworldly heroes, which I think in the end is actually harmful because, firstly, they're human beings, so they must be like us. They're not otherworldly. And secondly, it makes it harder for us to appreciate what it takes actually to be a great leader like that, if we just set them up on pedestals and worship them instead of really trying to understand them.
So my next question really is, at what point would somebody who's struggling with manic depression, at what point does it go from being a positive leadership quality and tip over into being either counterproductive or dangerous? I mean, the obvious tired example, because his name gets brought up so often, is Hitler.
Sure.
So with Hitler, he's obviously... I'll stay away from the obviously mentally ill because of his policies and his behaviours. But, I believe historically, psychiatrically, psychologically, he would have fallen into the category of a manic depressive. But then how do we what I'm getting at here, I guess, is how do we separate the ideology from the mental illness?
Right, and that's important to do. In First Rate Madness, I describe Hitler as having had manic and depressive episodes very clearly based on good primary source and medical medical data. I think it's very strong evidence for it, although some German doctors have pushed back. They really have a hard time accepting this. It's interesting. I've had pushback from the Germans on Hitler, from the British on Churchill, from the Indians on Gandhi.
Right.
So anyway, but I think that it is important to distinguish the ideology, because what I'm saying is not that manic depressive illness makes you a great crisis leader who then would do good things for humanity,
right.
Defining good things based on what I think is good or what you might think is good. We might disagree on what's good based on whether more left-wing or right-wing, even within acceptable Western definitions these days. But no, what I'm saying is it just makes you a good leader for whatever your political ideology or whatever your business activity is. It's independent of that. So Churchill viewed Hitler as being a great leader. He wrote a book in 1935 called Great Contemporaries, and in the Hitler chapter he praised his leadership skills. He was just a great leader for anti-Semitism and for German nationalism, which is not something that most of us would agree with. That's my view. I think Trump is a good leader too, but I think he's also a leader in the direction of white nationalism, which I personally think is very harmful.
Yeah, well, I was going to get onto the Trump thing now, and I think so. We'll just quickly dive into it. This I probably want to do an episode, a standalone episode on Trump and his apparent mental illness or whatever, his narcissism, whether he's unhinged. But yeah, I'm sort of applying your ideas now to what's going on at the moment. So, I mean, this idea of him being a crisis leader, and I know it's a peacetime administration at the moment, but I think in the lead up to the presidential elections between Trump and Hillary, I think some people did view people on the right, the Republicans, with the way the legacy of Obama and some of the Democratic policies, threats against freedom of speech, the Second Amendment, things like that. I wonder whether people do view Trump as a crisis leader. That there was a crisis going on in America that was about to reach sort of a fever pitch where the Constitution was about to be undermined, and that it was those traits about Trump that made the public want to elect him, not just as a man of the people, but all those things you've been talking about as somebody that's sort of a visionary, someone who's a bit more resilient and someone who's a bit more creative. But what do you think about that?
No, I agree. I mean, I think that first we should maybe just describe his traits first, and then talk about this. I think he has manic traits. He's distractible, very high energy, doesn't sleep much, very high sexual energy, obviously, as well, somewhat impulsive in general, and very talkative. These are all just straightforward manic traits. Now, usually people don't diagnose bipolar disorder, as we talked about, because it's required to have severe symptoms for a week or longer that come and go. But again, some of the unscientific nature of that view is it ignores the fact that there's plenty of research that shows that many people just have mild manic symptoms all the time as part of their personality, called hyperthymic temperament. And I think Trump basically, with reliable publicly available knowledge, meets that definition. Now, mania is associated with creativity and resilience to trauma and stress. We see that in the same way with the hyperthymic temperament as I've described in First Rate Madness with Franklin Roosevelt and with John Kennedy. And those are good examples of people who've been, very effective political leaders who were impulsive, high energy, but also very creative and resilient, both to medical illnesses in the case of Roosevelt, polio, Kennedy, severe Addison's disease, and political crises. In the case of Roosevelt, obviously the most, depression in World War II, and Kennedy, the Cold War. Now with Trump, psychologically speaking, I could say that he would have some of those same traits, which might make him a good crisis leader. and I think it got played out in the presidential campaign in that he was creative, especially. He saw, and this is very clear now, I think everybody accepts it, he saw the dynamics of a presidential campaign in terms of the Midwestern states and the white working class vote in a way that Hillary Clinton and the political establishment did not see. And he was very creative in seeing what was happening there and making use of it. He was also very creative in his use of social media and Twitter, and still is, in a way that nobody's ever done before. So these are clear signs of his creativity that played out well for him from the perspective of getting elected president. Now we can turn to the issue, though, of what is he as the actual president? And here my thesis would be that he would do well if there was a crisis. Now, this is not a psychiatric question, whether we're in a crisis or not, and I'm aware that historians, political analysts will have different views. I'll just put out my view. I don't think we are in a crisis from 2016 until now, because we're not in an economic crisis, as you pointed out. The economy is doing great. Mm-hmm. We're not in a major war. Obama, pulled us out of Iraq, and the other wars were kind of very low grade. We don't have we have constant cultural conflict, but not in the sense of any new crisis. In terms of a major crisis, I don't think we're having one. And so on my theory, then, Trump is the wrong kind of president for our country in a time of relative peace and prosperity. And instead, what he's doing, instead of leaving things alone or just tinkering at the edges, he's making important changes that are probably going to make things worse, such as a huge tax cut, which has given us a huge deficit, which may then plunge us into another recession in a couple of years or 5 years, like happened with George W. Bush, or stoking the tensions with Iran to the extent that it didn't have to be. We already had a nice deal with it, which may lead to a major Middle Eastern conflict in the next few years. We'll see. But if I'm right, what Trump is doing now is going to cause crises a couple of years down the road. And the funny thing about it would be that if he's still president, maybe he'd handle those crises actually pretty well that he himself caused. Or maybe he'll get out by then and we'll have a nice Democratic manic depressive president who would do an even better job.
Yeah, or even worse, based on everything we've spoken about.
But it depends on what you want. I mean, personally, I think that a huge deficit and depression is a bad thing, and Middle Eastern conflict is a bad thing. There are people in the right wing in the U.S. who want Middle Eastern conflict and who don't care about depressions as long as the rich people get more tax cuts. These are political opinions, of course.
Yeah, I was just thinking then to say that you might have, if Donald Trump causes a major crisis and then the public responds by saying, we don't want another one of him, we want someone who's more normal. So then you've got a crisis going on being led by someone who's mentally healthy and therefore not the right person to deal with it. Yeah. That
doesn't work out either. Yeah. But, we had a little bit of an analogy to that in the U.S. when Jimmy Carter was elected after Richard Nixon. Now, Nixon wasn't psychiatrically ill probably, but he was definitely created a crisis with Watergate and Vietnam dragged out. And Jimmy Carter is a very stable, mentally healthy, normal, good person. And he just couldn't handle the crises of his time, as we know.
Okay, so sort of bringing this to a close now, I've got a couple more sort of practical questions maybe for people listening. So, I mean, there's going to be people listening to this podcast, a good portion of my audience will be in the bipolar or the manic depressive category, either diagnosed, self-diagnosed, whichever, that might be listening to this and thinking that, well, a lot of people get this diagnosis and they just suffer with it. There's not really much of a creative outlet or anything to sort of to do with it. They're not in leadership positions. And so, the first question would be whether you've got an opinion on what people can do that are in that situation to channel their illness into something positive, because it seems like from what you've been saying, there's great potential there. But how can people start to realize that? Right.
So I think one way to approach this, and then I use the example of leaders and leadership, as I said, partly just mainly because people hadn't done so before, and I thought it was important from a social perspective, but both at getting at stigma, but also at having more success with our leaders. But I think that the discussion about the benefits of manic and depressive traits goes beyond leadership. They're beneficial in general in life, and they can. If you're a leader, they're useful for leadership. If you're a writer or an artist, they're useful in other ways. If you're in any other kind of field, they can be useful. I think one thing that people could take away is to play to their strengths. This is where it might matter, not so much if you're technically bipolar, but if you have both manic and depressive symptoms, you will have certain strengths. And if you have, say, just the manic symptoms or just the depressive symptoms, you will have other strengths. And people should be aware of that and play to it. So, for instance, if you have manic depressive symptoms, both manic and depressive, it may be harder to work in a corporation or in some kind of company that's very hierarchical and regular and organized, where mental health is really valued in the sense of being stable, reliable, showing up on time, and being highly sociable and friendly with everybody. On the other hand, that kind of person might do better in a more flexible work environment. For instance, a startup, an entrepreneurial setting, a part-time position would allow them more flexibility so that their manic impulsivity doesn't cause too much trouble, or their depressive symptoms when sometimes they can't function as well doesn't cause too much trouble. If they're only depressed, for instance, then I think they would want to think about ways where their empathy and their realism could stand out, for instance, in service positions and nonprofit organizations and such. So I think it's about thinking about these traits as positives in some ways that haven't been appreciated, and obviously some negatives that everybody knows about, and trying to play to the strengths more than the negatives. Okay.
And then on the flip side of that, for people that would be considered mentally normal, is it possible for those people to mimic or copy or learn from the positive leadership and creative qualities of someone that is manic depressive, or a mentally normal people just sort of doomed to mediocrity? Like, they're never going to be great leaders, they're never going to be great artists.
Yeah. Well, I think my approach here just gives us maybe another angle with which to address this problem. It's an old problem. It's the problem of ethics and behavior. Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics wrote about his famous concept of the golden mean. And his idea was you just take a look at your natural traits, and if you tend to go to the extreme one way or the other, then you kind of consciously, by habit, try to learn to go in the other direction, to go more towards the middle. So if you're naturally very shy and maybe a little cowardly, then you consciously try to take habits where you take risks, where you take risks you think you wouldn't, and that would make you a little more towards the middle in terms of courage. I think my way of putting it is just psychologically updating the view that we all have certain natural propensities. Some of them are more positive than others, and we just need to learn how to adjust what we do consciously by habit so that we can kind of go in the direction that's better. So, empathy and realism are valued, but people often, because they're abstract, why should you be empathic? How can you be empathic? Well, maybe one way of understanding that is we're connecting it to depression and saying, well, if you're a little down, maybe that's one way that you can actually connect to people a little more. And if you're normal mentally healthy and you're not normally down much, then that just gives you permission to go down a little. We all can. We all have the capacity to be a little down. We all have the capacity to be a little high and a little manic-like, and it gives permission to people to do that as well. In other words, it's just keeping us from feeling constrained to normality, that it's okay to go in either direction with one's mood and one's affect, and then consciously linking that to these traits of realism, empathy, creativity, resilience, seeking to achieve those traits. And, as Aristotle said, you can learn these things by habit. It's harder if you aren't naturally inclined to it. If you don't have manic depressive traits, it's harder, but it still can be done. And I think that's one of the messages that I hope can grow out of these ideas.
So those normal amongst you, I'm not one of them, sort of luckily. Not necessarily doomed to mediocrity. So I suppose that's a good message to finish on. So Nasir, before I let you go, are there any links, any websites you'd like to direct the listeners to? Are you on social media? Feel free to plug away.
Sure. Yeah, well, I'll just briefly say, I do have a Twitter account on social media, which has some links to some things I do. And I have a website, which is my author website with links to my books. It's just NassirGhaemi.com.
Okay, great. As always, I will include links to those in the show notes, including Nassir's book. So, in the meantime, Dr. Nassir Ghaemi, thank you very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Okay, folks, if you enjoyed this episode or you're enjoying this podcast in general and you'd like to help support it, this is just a quick message to let you know that you can now join our little exclusive members-only community over at Patreon, where for as little as $2 a month, you can gain access to exclusive content like the quickfire questions portion from my interviews and my AMA or Ask Me Anything episodes. There's also a members-only newsletter where I give you a little sneak peek into what kind of guests and content to expect over the coming weeks. You can help me steer the ship a little bit by telling me the kind of content you'd like me to produce, and there's also the opportunity to join a private Facebook group where you can interact directly with myself and fellow patrons to share tips and advice and support one another on your own mental health recovery journeys. So if this sounds like a community you'd like to be a part of, please go to patreon.com/myownworstenemy and sign up for as little as $2 a month, which, let's face it, is less than the price of a coffee, and not even one of them like fancy double Belgian chocolate latte bollocks. It's probably cheaper than like a plain old shitty Nescafe from the office vending machine, and it won't give you the jitters or make your breath smell of arse, so bargain. Alternatively, for those of you who do want to help support the podcast, but you can't be arsed with all the extra bells and whistles, you can make a standard one-time or monthly donation by going to our support page at myownworstenemy.org/support. And that's about it. So, as always, thank you for listening, and I'll see you again next time.